south of Montgomery. By April,
the gunner pressed the trigger and watched his shell fly true. It struck the hull dead center and bounced off. He reloaded, fired again. Another ricochet. Then a third round, same result. The machine rolling toward his position weighed 30 tons. It moved at 33 miles per hour across open ground. Its hull was angled at 60 degrees from vertical, and the best anti-tank gun in the German infantry arsenal could not scratch it. German soldiers had a name for the 3.7 centimeter Pak 36. They called it the Heeresangklopfgurt, the army door knocker. It could knock, but it could not get in. The thing behind that armor would change every tank built for the next half-century. Its designer was already dead when the first German shell bounced off it, and the men who captured one who climbed inside and measured every rivet could not believe what the Soviets had built. June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border at dawn. It was the largest military invasion in the history of warfare. 150 divisions stretched across a front 1,800 miles long. 3,000 tanks led the advance. The Wehrmacht expected total collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. The officer corps was drunk on victory. Poland had fallen in 5 weeks, France in 6. The Soviet Union, Hitler told his generals, would be easier, and at first the numbers confirmed the prediction. The Red Army's tank fleet was enormous, over 22,000 vehicles, more tanks than every other army on Earth combined. But the vast majority were obsolete. T-26 light tanks based on a British Vickers design from 1930. But the vast majority were obsolete. T-26 light tanks based on a British Vickers design from 1930. BT series fast tanks built on an American suspension system. Thin-skinned machines that burned when hit by almost anything. The Panzer III and Panzer IV carved through them without difficulty. By early July, the Wehrmacht had encircled and captured over 320,000 Soviet soldiers at Bialystok-Minsk alone. Smolensk fell next. Another 300,000 prisoners. The Soviet Air Force lost nearly 4,000 aircraft in the first week, most of them destroyed on the ground. The numbers looked like a war already won. But buried inside that collapsing army was something nobody in Berlin had accounted for. Fewer than 1,000 of them existed on the day of the invasion. They were spread thin, concentrated in 5 of 29 mechanized corps. Their crews were barely trained. They broke down constantly. They had no radios, no coordination, no tactical doctrine worth the name. None of that mattered, because when they worked, nothing in the German arsenal could stop them. The trap had been set not by a Soviet general, but by an engineer who once made candy for a living. That estimate of fewer than 1,000 T-34s was going to be wrong by a factor of 80. Mikhail Koshkin grew up in a peasant family near Yaroslavl. His father died cutting timber when the boy was 7. His mother worked day and night to keep the children fed. By 11, Koshkin left home and walked to Moscow to find work. His first job was in a candy factory. He made caramels. He was good at it. By his mid-20s, he ran an entire confectionery operation in the city of Vyatka. Then the Soviet state decided it needed engineers more than it needed candy. Koshkin was sent to study. He graduated with honors from the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute in 1934 as a design engineer. Within 3 years, he rose from junior specialist to deputy chief designer at the Kirov plant in Leningrad. In 1937, the Red Army gave him the task that would define his life and end it. Design a replacement for the BT fast tanks. Do it at the Kharkiv Comintern locomotive plant in Ukraine. The BT series was blindingly fast, over 50 miles per hour on roads without tracks. Its suspension was designed by an American engineer named J. Walter Christie. On good roads, these tanks could outrun almost anything with an engine. But the Spanish Civil War and border clashes with Japan at Khalkhin Gol had exposed a brutal truth. Speed meant nothing when a single anti-tank round turned your vehicle into a coffin. These tanks burned easily. Their armor was thin enough to be pierced by heavy machine gun fire at close range. They died in droves against competent anti-tank guns. Koshkin kept the Christie suspension for off-road mobility. He kept the speed. Then he did something no other tank designer in the world had done at that scale. He angled the armor. 45 millimeters of steel plate sloped at 60 degrees from vertical. The mathematics were elegant. A shell fired horizontally at that plate did not strike square. It hit at an oblique angle. The effective thickness doubled to roughly 90 millimeters. A shell that would punch clean through vertical armor glanced off the slope instead. It skidded. It ricocheted into the dirt. And the tank kept moving. He mounted a 76.2 millimeter F-34 gun, far larger and more powerful than anything on a German medium tank. The Panzer III carried a 50 millimeter gun. The Panzer IV still used a short-barreled 75 millimeter designed for infantry support, not for killing other tanks. Koshkin's gun could do both. He fitted a Model V2 34 diesel engine, a 12-cylinder power plant producing 500 horsepower. Diesel, not gasoline. A gasoline engine, when the fuel tank was hit, turned a tank into an inferno in seconds. Diesel was harder to ignite. It gave crews a few more seconds to escape, and in a burning tank, seconds were everything. Wide tracks spread the tank's weight across soft ground. They could cross mud, snow, and the bottomless Rasputitsa, the Russian mud season that would swallow a Panzer III to its belly plate. German tanks sat stranded in black muck while the T-34 drove past them. On paper, it was the best medium tank on Earth. The prototype was designated A-32. On December 19, 1939, it was accepted into service under the name T-34. Koshkin would never know what it became. In March 1940, 2 prototypes were ready for final demonstration. The Kremlin wanted to see them. Standard procedure was to load the tanks onto railway flat cars and ship them to Moscow. Koshkin refused. He would drive them himself. 2,000 kilometers. Kharkiv to Moscow, then north to the Mannerheim Line in Finland where the Red Army was fighting, then back via Minsk and Kiev. Through snowstorms, through freezing rain, through roads that dissolved into frozen ruts and ice, in an unheated steel box that shook his bones at every bump. The tanks made it. They proved everything Koshkin had promised. Mobility over terrain that would stop a wheeled vehicle dead. Armor that deflected simulated fire. A gun that outranged everything the Soviets had fielded before. The Kremlin approved full production on March 31, 1940, but the drive destroyed the man who made it. Koshkin contracted pneumonia on the frozen roads between Kharkiv and Moscow. The cold and the exhaustion shattered his already worn-down body. He refused to stop working. His condition worsened through the spring and summer. Doctors removed one of his lungs. It was not enough. On September 26, 1940, the chief designer of the T-34 died in a factory sanatorium near Kharkiv. He was 41 years old. 9 months later, the machine he gave his life to build met the army it was designed to fight. His successor, Alexander Morozov, would oversee its mass production and receive the medals the Hero of Socialist Labor twice awarded. A posthumous Stalin Prize in 1942. The Hero of Socialist Labor title did not come until 1990, 50 years after his death, by presidential decree in the final months of the Soviet Union. The first production T-34s rolled off the Kharkiv assembly line that September. By June 22, 1941, fewer than 1,000 existed. Most were concentrated in 5 mechanized corps scattered across a border that was about to collapse under 3 million German soldiers. That dispersion was going to cost the Red Army dearly before the T-34 could save it. The first German units to encounter the T-34 did not understand what they were seeing. Late June 1941, barely a week into the invasion, a machine appeared that looked like nothing in the recognition manuals. Low slung. Fast, its hull was a wedge of angled steel that tapered to a sharp glasses plate. They opened fire with everything available. The 37mm PaK-36, the standard infantry anti-tank weapon, did nothing.
April 1945. After nearly 6 years of war, the Red Army stands massed on the banks of the Oder River in eastern Germany. The Nazi capital and Hitler's bunker are just 60 kilometers away.
Shells hit the hull and skipped off like stones thrown at a boulder. There are documented cases of dozens of hits from PaK-36s that did not affect the combat capability of a single T-34.
Special tactics, similar to those General Vasily Trikov learned during the fighting.
The crews fired until their ammunition was spent. The T-34 kept coming. The 50mm guns on the Panzer III fared little better at standard engagement range. Only the 88mm flat gun, a massive anti-aircraft weapon never designed for ground combat, could reliably penetrate the T-34's frontal plate. But the 88 weighed over 5 tons. It required a dedicated crew and a towing vehicle. It could not be repositioned quickly. And there were never enough of them. The T-34's 76.2mm gun could kill a Panzer III at 1,000 meters. The Panzer III's 50mm gun could not penetrate a T-34's front armor at any range using standard ammunition. The mathematics were one-directional. The physics were simple. The implications were catastrophic. Reports began filtering back to Berlin. Panzer crews described a tank that shrugged off direct hits and kept advancing. Anti-tank units described shells bouncing off in every direction. Infantry commanders described something close to panic in their gun crews, men who had been confident for 2 years, suddenly helpless. Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist, one of Germany's most experienced armored commanders, said it plainly. Their T-34 was the best in the world. But the T-34 was not invincible. It had a 2-man turret the commander had to load the gun, aim, give orders, and navigate simultaneously. In the chaos of combat, this was almost impossible. Most T-34s had no radios. Crews communicated with signal flags, a system that worked on a parade ground and nowhere else. Training was measured in weeks, not months. Some crews went into combat having fired their main gun fewer than a dozen times. Soviet tactical doctrine in 1941 was suicidal tanks thrown headlong into piecemeal frontal counterattacks with no coordination, no artillery support, no infantry screen. Thousands of T-34s were destroyed not by German firepower, but by German tactics. By the end of 1941, the Red Army had lost over 20,000 tanks, including 2,300 T-34s and 900 KV heavy tanks. And that was the paradox that would define the Eastern Front for the next 2 years. The Soviets had built a better tank. The Germans had built a better army. The question was which advantage would last longer. For the men who designed Germany's panzers, the answer was already visible and terrifying. Because the T-34's weaknesses could be fixed with training and radios. Its strengths were baked into the steel. October 6, 1941, Colonel General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army was driving toward Moscow. The 4th Panzer Division Guderian spearhead approached a small town called Mtsensk, south of the capital. They expected light resistance. They were about to find out what a T-34 could do when handled by a competent commander. Waiting for them was Colonel Mikhail Katukov. He had 22 T-34s, 7 KV-1 heavy tanks, 32 older BT-7 light tanks. That was it. Less than a brigade against a full Panzer division. Katukov did something the Germans had not seen a Soviet commander do in 4 months of war. He refused to attack. He dug in. He positioned his T-34s in hull-down ambush points, using the terrain to hide everything below the turret. Soviet defenders held the city for 2 weeks before it fell. German casualties at Smolensk were heavier than anything they had suffered since the invasion began. For the first time, the timetable cracked. He assigned each tank 3 or 4 alternate firing positions prepared in advance. He set up dummy emplacements logs painted to look like gun barrels to draw German fire and reveal their positions. His crews had assembled their own tanks at the Stalingrad tractor factory. They knew every bolt, every weakness, every strength of the machine they were fighting in. Then Katukov let the 4th Panzer Division cross the Oka River Bridge and hit them from the flank. The German panzers could not penetrate the T-34s at combat range. Katukov's tanks fired, knocked out German vehicles, then reversed into cover. They withdrew to a second position, appeared again, fired again. withdrew once more to a third. The Germans advanced into what felt like a moving wall of armored steel. It took Guderian 9 days to advance 60 kilometers. 9 days, against fewer than 30 operational T-34s. For the first time in the war, German Panzer crews experienced what the Poles and the French had felt in 1939 and 1940. Outgunned, out-armored, outmaneuvered by a tank they could not kill from the front. Guderian wrote in his memoirs that the losses caused a shock that was less physical than spiritual. The certainty that had carried the Wehrmacht from Warsaw to the gates of Moscow cracked on the road to Mtsensk. Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade was redesignated the 1st Guards Tank Brigade, the first Soviet tank unit to receive the Guards title in the entire war. But Guderian was not thinking about Soviet honors. He was thinking about what he had seen when German engineers climbed inside a captured T-34 and measured every surface. November 1941. A special commission arrived at Guderian's headquarters with the 2nd Panzer Army. This was not a routine inspection. The team included officers from the Army Ordnance Office, representatives from Germany's armaments industry, tank designers from the country's leading manufacturers, the same men who had designed and built the Panzer III and Panzer IV. They had been sent to the front to examine captured T-34s and report back to the Ministry of Armaments. What they found shattered their assumptions about Soviet engineering. The armor was not merely thick. It was sloped in a way that no German production tank had ever implemented. The 76.2mm gun outranged and outpunched every turret weapon mounted on a German medium tank. The wide tracks provided ground pressure low enough to cross terrain that immobilized narrower, tracked German vehicles. The diesel engine was powerful, fuel efficient, and far more resistant to catching fire than any gasoline engine. But the production details stunned them the most. The T-34 was built from flat steel plates, flame-cut and welded together. No complex curved castings requiring specialized foundries, no precision machining that demanded years of training. The welds were rough, sometimes crude. The interior finish was Spartan. Gear shifting in the early models sometimes required a mallet because the transmission was so stiff. None of that mattered, because this tank could be assembled by workers who had never seen a factory 6 months earlier. In a fraction of the time required to build a Panzer III. The German troops who had fought these machines had a simple recommendation for the commission. Take the T-34 back to Germany. Copy it bolt for bolt. It was the highest compliment the German military could pay to a foreign design. It was also a quiet admission that the men who had conquered France in 6 weeks could not conquer Soviet engineering. Guderian agreed in principle. He demanded a complete rethinking of German tank philosophy. Improved mobility, greater armor protection, a heavier main gun capable of killing the T-34 at range. But a direct copy was impossible. Guderian himself outlined the reasons. Germany could not mass-produce the T-34's aluminum diesel engine. The Soviet Union had aluminum resources that Germany simply did not have. German steel alloys were inferior to Soviet formulations for armor plate, a raw materials problem with no short-term solution. And German engineering culture would not permit a straight reproduction of a foreign weapon. It was not designer pride, Guderian wrote later. It was industrial reality. So Germany would do what it always did when confronted with a technical problem. It would over-engineer the solution. Make it heavier. Make it more complex. Make it more expensive. And by the time it arrived on the battlefield, the Soviets would have built 10,000 more T-34s. On November 25, 1941, 2 contracts were issued. One to Daimler-Benz, the makers of the Panzer III. One to MAN, Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg. Design a new medium tank to counter the T-34. It would be called the Panther. The ghost of a dead candy maker was about to reshape the entire German war machine. While the Germans were studying captured T-34s, the Soviets were saving the factories that built them. September 1941. The Wehrmacht was closing on Kharkiv, the city where the T-34 was born. Factory 183, the plant where Koshkin had designed his masterpiece, sat directly in the German path. If it fell, the T-34 production line died with it. On September 13th, the evacuation order came. 43 trains, every lathe, every stamping press, every welding jig, every set of technical drawings, loaded onto flat cars and sent 1,800 kilometers east to Nizhny Tagil in the Ural Mountains. The first train left on September 17th, the last on October 19th. Workers rode alongside their machines in open freight cars through autumn rain and the first snows of winter. This was not a single factory on the move. Across the Soviet Union, over 1,500 industrial plants were being dismantled simultaneously. 1.5 million railcar loads of equipment, workers, and raw materials all heading east, away from the front. The Kirov tank factory from Leningrad went to Chelyabinsk. Chelyabinsk became Tankograd Tank City. The name was not propaganda, it was a statement of purpose. By December 1941, the first T-34 assembled at the relocated factory in Nizhny Tagil rolled off the production line, 90 days after the evacuation order. Some of the machines were not yet bolted to the concrete. Parts of the factory still had no roof. Workers assembled tanks in temperatures that dropped below -20 Celsius. Their breath froze on the steel. The production philosophy was brutal, pragmatic, and effective. Welds replaced precision castings wherever possible. Components were standardized across factories separated by hundreds of kilometers. Interchangeable parts came from dozens of subplants spread across the Urals and western Siberia. The time to produce a single T-34 hull dropped from 200 hours before the war to 36 hours at the Gorky plant in December 1941. Full hull assembly fell from 9 days to 2. Women built these tanks. Teenagers built them. Pensioners built them. Workers who had never held a welding torch 6 months earlier built them. Komsomol youth brigades, some of them girls who had replaced fathers and brothers sent to the front, worked double shifts on 2 or 3 machines at once. In Stalingrad, T-34s rolled off the tractor factory assembly line and drove directly to the front line, sometimes without paint.
April 1945.
By 1943, the Stalingrad tractor factory itself was in German hands, bombed, shelled, and fought over room by room. It did not matter. The production had already moved beyond German reach. The Soviets were building war machines the way Henry Ford built automobiles, at scale, at speed, with acceptable imperfection. Germany took 55,000 man-hours to build one Panther tank. The Soviet Union took roughly 5,000 man-hours to build one T-34. 11 T-34s for every Panther. The arithmetic of the Eastern Front was being written not in strategy rooms, but on factory floors, and the Germans could not outrun it. The Panther was everything the T-34 was not. Elegant, precise, over-engineered, Daimler-Benz proposed a design that looked remarkably like the T-34. Rear-mounted turret. Diesel engine. Sloped armor modeled directly on the Soviet original. Hitler preferred it. The Army Ordnance Office chose the MAN design instead. It had a larger turret ring that could accept a bigger gun. The new 75mm KWK-42L70, a high-velocity weapon that could kill a T-34 at 1,500 meters. 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, the feature copied directly from Koshkin's design. On paper, it was the superior machine. It was supposed to weigh 35 tons. By the time production started, it weighed 45. The final drives, designed for a lighter vehicle, sheared under the extra 10 tons of steel. The transmission failed after barely 100 kilometers of road travel. The Maybach gasoline engine overheated in summer. Fuel lines leaked and caught fire. Crews were told to limit road marches to preserve the drivetrain. Panthers had to be moved by rail wherever possible, a tank that could not drive to the battlefield without breaking down. July 5, 1943, the Battle of Kursk. The largest tank engagement in the history of warfare. 184 Panther tanks roll into combat for the first time. It is their debut rush to the front before the mechanical problems are resolved, because Hitler demanded it. 2 days later, only 40 are still operational. Most are not destroyed by Soviet fire. They are destroyed by their own machinery. Transmissions seize in the July heat. Engines ignite without warning. Crews abandon vehicles that have never been hit by a single enemy round. The tank born from Germany's panic over the T-34 cannot survive its own weight. The machine that took 55,000 man-hours to build dies in a Ukrainian field without being shot. The Panther would improve. Later variants, the OSF-A and OSF-G, addressed the worst of the mechanical failures. By early 1944, frontline crews reported that the Panther in its mature form surpassed the T-34 in armament, armor, speed, and cross-country mobility. The gun was devastating, accurate, and lethal at ranges the T-34's 76mm gun could not match. The optics were superb. German Zeiss sights gave the Panther's gunner a clear advantage in target acquisition. In a one-on-one engagement, a well-crewed Panther could kill a T-34 before the Soviet crew even knew it was there. But Germany built approximately 6,000 Panthers across the entire war. The Soviet Union built over 57,000 T-34s during the same period. The ratio was nearly 10-1. Quality without quantity is an engineering achievement. Quantity with adequate quality is a war-winning strategy. The T-34 was never the best tank on the field after 1943. It did not need to be. It just needed to keep coming. And it never stopped. The T-34 paid for its victories in blood. Soviet tank losses were unlike anything seen in the history of armored warfare. Over 15,000 tanks lost in 1942 alone. Another 22,000 in 1943. 44,900 T-34s were destroyed or damaged across the entire war. More tanks than most nations have ever built in total. But the factories in the Urals never stopped. They could not be bombed. They were 1,000 kilometers beyond the range of any German aircraft. They could not be reached by any advancing army. They ran day and night through every season for 4 years straight. In 1944, the T-34-85 entered production. A new, larger turret with a 3-man crew, finally freeing the commander from having to load the gun himself. An 85mm gun that could engage the Panther at medium range. Improved optics and better radio equipment, it was still not the best tank on the battlefield. But it could be built fast, repaired fast, and replaced fast. That was enough. A damaged T-34 could be stripped for parts in the field and returned to a depot for rebuilding. A damaged Panther was often abandoned where it fell because the recovery vehicles could not tow 45 tons out of Ukrainian mud. The T-34 rolled into Warsaw. It rolled into Budapest. It rolled into Vienna. It rolled into the streets of Berlin itself. The machine that Mikhail Koshkin designed in a locomotive factory in Kharkiv drove through the front gate of the Reich Chancellery in the spring of 1945. Over 80,000 T-34s of all variants were ultimately built. It was the most produced tank of the Second World War. The second most produced tank in all of history, surpassed only by its own successor, the T-54. 27 countries were still operating T-34s as late as 1996. Some fought in the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. The design that stunned German engineers in November 1941 was still in combat half a century later. The Panther, the tank Germany built to answer the T-34, never saw a single day of service after May 1945. Its production lines were bombed to rubble. Its factories were overrun. Its complexity was its epitaph. The German gunner who watched his shell bounce off a T-34 in the summer of 1941 could not have understood what he was looking at. He saw a tank. He was looking at a revolution. Mikhail Koshkin died in a sanatorium bed 9 months before the invasion. He was 41 years old. He never fired a shot in anger. He never saw a battlefield. He never knew that German engineers would crawl inside his creation and stare in disbelief. He never knew that the machine he designed would force Germany to abandon its entire medium tank program and start again from nothing. He built a machine so effective that it forced the most advanced industrial nation in Europe to redesign its entire armored fleet. So simple that teenagers could assemble it in roofless factories in the dead of winter. So durable that armies were still driving it 50 years after his death. The Germans called the Pak-36 the door knocker. It knocked on the T-34's armor plate in 1941. And nothing happened. So they built the Panther to answer a question the T-34 had asked. And by the time the answer arrived, the question had already moved on. 57,000 T-34s. Assembled by women and teenagers in factories, moved by train across a continent in wartime. Driven into battle by crews who sometimes had weeks of training and no radios. A machine designed by a man who started his working life making caramels in a Moscow sweet shop. A machine that no German engineer could believe had been built and no German factory could match. Somewhere in the Urals, the factory floors where they were built are still standing. The lathes are gone. The workers are gone. But outside, on a concrete plinth at the factory gate, a T-34 sits in the snow. Its gun points west. It always has. If this one stayed with you, there are others like it on this channel. We go looking for the stories the textbooks leave in the footnotes, the ones that deserve better than a paragraph. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you. And if you know someone who would sit with this story the way you just did, send it to them. The next video is already waiting.